Lone Cowboy claimed a pregnant widow at auction, until she whispered, "You'll regret this." The morning sun rose slowly over the small town of Silver Creek, painting the dusty streets in shades of gold. Birds chirped softly, and the smell of hay and leather floated from the stables nearby. Most of the townsfolk were used to quiet mornings like this, where life moved slowly and predictably. Today, however, the air held a strange tension, a quiet buzz of curiosity that made people glance at each other and whisper. There was an auction scheduled, and while auctions were normal in Silver Creek, this one was different. People were gathering in the town square. Men in worn hats and boots spoke quietly among themselves, while women in simple dresses clutched their baskets and children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts. The auction had been advertised as a regular event: livestock, farm tools, and perhaps a few pieces of property. But the main attraction this morning was something unusual, something that made even the oldest residents stop and stare. Clara, a young widow, was standing quietly near the edge of the crowd. Her dress was simple and faded, and her hair fell loosely around her shoulders, catching the sunlight in soft waves. She was several months pregnant, her small hands resting protectively on her rounded belly. The loss of her husband had left her without family, without protection, and now by law she was being put up at the auction. In Silver Creek, it was customary for property, land, and sometimes even personal caretaking arrangements to be claimed through this process. It was a harsh rule, but the townspeople had long accepted it as part of life. Clara's eyes scanned the crowd nervously. She knew what this meant. She would be under someone else's authority, someone she had no choice to refuse. Her stomach tightened with fear, and yet there was a spark of defiance in her eyes. She straightened her back and squared her shoulders. If she had to face this, she would face it with her head held high. The auctioneer, an older man with a sharp voice and an even sharper eye, called the crowd to attention. He spoke of the items up for bid, moving quickly through the livestock and tools, until he reached the point that made everyone hush. "Next," he said, his voice echoing slightly, "we have Clara, a young widow with no family. She will be claimed according to the rules." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some people shook their heads, their expressions full of pity. Others whispered that it was unfair, that the law was too strict, that the woman deserved more than this. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, but she did not speak. She had learned that words often did not change fate, and today she would have to rely on something else: her courage, her instincts, and perhaps luck. Then a movement from the back of the crowd caught everyone's attention. A lone man, tall and sturdy, stepped forward. His boots were worn, his hat tilted slightly down, and his eyes were calm and watchful. This was Jack Harper, a cowboy who had lived on the outskirts of Silver Creek for years. He was known for his independence, his quiet strength, and the way he seemed to carry the open plains in his heart wherever he went. He rarely came into town, and when he did, it was usually with a purpose, and he did not waste words. Jack raised his hand, signaling that he was claiming Clara. The crowd gasped. Some frowned, others nodded in approval, and a few exchanged worried glances. Jack's reputation preceded him. People knew that he was fair but firm, and they wondered how he would treat the young widow. Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. She felt a mix of fear and anger, but also, strangely, a flicker of hope. Perhaps this man would not be cruel. Perhaps he would let her keep some dignity. She stepped slightly closer, so close that her whisper, soft and trembling, reached only him. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice barely audible. It was not a threat, not exactly. It was a promise, a challenge, a statement of who she was. Clara did not intend to be anyone's passive charge. She had survived the loss of her husband. She had survived the loneliness and fear of being alone and pregnant in a small town. And now she would survive whatever this cowboy intended for her. Jack's eyes met hers. There was no anger there, no surprise, only a calm understanding, as if he recognized the weight behind her words. He tipped his hat slightly and said nothing. The auctioneer banged his gavel, and the decision was final. Clara was now to go with Jack, and there was no turning back. The townspeople murmured among themselves, some offering quick condolences, others shaking their heads in judgment. Clara's gaze remained steady, her hand resting protectively on her belly. As they walked away from the auction, the streets of Silver Creek seemed to stretch longer, emptier, and somehow heavier. Clara's mind raced with questions. Who was this man really? Would he be kind or strict? Could she trust him? Could she even trust herself to survive under someone else's authority? The wind whipped through the streets, and she pulled her shawl closer around her shoulders. Jack's stride was steady and sure, and though he did not speak, Clara could feel the silent weight of his presence beside her. The journey to Jack's ranch took them out of the town entirely, across fields of dry grass and past the occasional wooden fence. The prairie stretched endlessly, golden and vast under the morning sun. Clara had never been this far from Silver Creek. She had never seen the land like this, wide and wild, with nothing but sky above and earth below. It was beautiful in a way that was frightening. She realized that here, out in the open, there would be no neighbors to watch over her, no friends to protect her. She would have to rely on herself. Jack finally stopped in front of his ranch, a modest collection of wooden buildings surrounded by open fields and a corral full of horses. The smell of fresh hay, leather, and earth filled the air. Clara took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. The ranch was larger than she had imagined, but it felt isolated, almost lonely, like it had been waiting for someone to come and give it purpose. Jack turned to her, his eyes scanning her face, trying to read her expression. Clara met his gaze evenly, refusing to show fear, refusing to show weakness. There was a quiet moment between them, a shared understanding that their lives had just become intertwined, whether they wanted it or not. The first hours at the ranch were filled with introductions to the land and its routines. Jack showed Clara the small cabin where she would stay, pointed out the animals that needed care, and explained the daily chores. He was efficient, clear, and to the point. Clara listened carefully, absorbing every detail, every instruction. She knew that survival here would require attention, diligence, and a willingness to learn quickly. Despite the uncertainty, there was something in Jack's demeanor that gave her a small measure of reassurance. He was firm, yes, but not cruel. He did not raise his voice, did not make harsh demands. There was a rhythm to his work, a quiet orderliness, and somehow, Clara felt that if she could prove herself, if she could show her strength and determination, there might be a way to coexist. As the day passed, Clara explored the ranch, taking in the wide fields, the sturdy fences, and the animals grazing peacefully in the sun. She could see how much work it would take to manage this land, how much effort Jack had put into maintaining it. And though her heart was heavy with uncertainty, she also felt a spark of determination. She would not be a passive figure in this story. She would work, she would learn, she would survive, and she would make sure that Jack understood she was not to be underestimated. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of pink and orange, Clara sat quietly outside the cabin. The wind rustled through the grass, carrying the distant sounds of the prairie, birds settling in for the night, the soft clatter of hooves, the low murmur of the animals in the corral. She placed a hand on her belly, feeling the gentle movements of her unborn child, and thought about the day that had just passed. She had been claimed at an auction, whisked away to a strange land, and yet somehow she felt a flicker of hope. Jack approached, carrying a small lantern to light the cabin. He glanced at her briefly, then turned back to his own work. Clara watched him, wondering about the man who had claimed her life in such a sudden, irreversible way. She remembered her whispered words, the promise she had made. "You'll regret this." She did not know if he would regret it or if she would, but she knew one thing for certain. Her life was about to change forever, and she would face it with courage, determination, and the quiet strength that had carried her this far. The first night at the ranch was quiet and filled with uncertainty. Clara lay awake, listening to the sounds of the prairie, feeling both fear and anticipation. She thought about the town she had left behind, the people who had watched the auction, and the man who now stood at the center of her life. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing. She would face it with her head held high, and she would not be a silent, passive participant in this story. As the stars began to fill the night sky, Clara closed her eyes and whispered once more, almost to herself, "You'll regret this." It was no longer just a warning to Jack. It was a promise to herself that she would endure, that she would survive, and that she would not be broken. Somewhere in the quiet darkness, she could feel the faintest stirrings of hope. Perhaps this strange new life, this unexpected turn of fate, might not be as frightening as she had first imagined. The wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying with it the endless possibilities of the prairie. And as Clara drifted into a restless sleep, one thought remained clear in her mind. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it. The morning after Clara arrived at the ranch, the prairie stretched endlessly under a pale blue sky. The sun had barely climbed above the horizon, but the land already seemed alive with the soft sounds of morning. Birds chirped in the distant trees, horses nickered in the corral, and the wind whispered across the golden grass. For Clara, it was a world completely different from Silver Creek. The town had been confined, predictable, and familiar. Here the land seemed limitless, powerful, and at times frightening. She took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill her lungs. She had survived the auction, survived the journey, and now she had to survive the life of the ranch. Jack Harper was already awake, moving with the quiet efficiency that Clara had begun to notice. He worked without hesitation, tending to the horses, checking fences, and making sure the animals had food and water. Each motion was precise, practiced, and necessary. Clara watched him from the porch of her small cabin, feeling a mixture of admiration and intimidation. This was a man who had lived here alone, who had carved a life from the wilderness, and he seemed untouchable in his calm authority. "You'll need to start early," Jack said without looking up, his voice steady but not unkind. "The animals, the fences, the barn, everything needs attention before the sun climbs too high." Clara nodded, gripping her hands nervously. She wanted to speak, to ask questions, to understand the routines, but words felt small compared to the vastness of the ranch. So she simply followed, learning by watching, by moving as Jack moved, by listening to the quiet instructions he offered. The first days were exhausting. Clara quickly discovered that living on a ranch was not like tending to a small garden or helping in a simple household. The animals required constant attention, the fences needed repair, the water had to be carried long distances, and the chores were unrelenting. Jack was strict but fair. He explained tasks clearly, corrected mistakes without anger, and expected her to learn quickly. Clara, in turn, threw herself into the work, determined to prove that she was capable. She had survived hardship before, and she refused to fail now. Despite the routine, tension simmered between them. Jack was a man of few words, and Clara was determined not to appear weak. They clashed sometimes over small details, the way a fence post was set, the timing of feeding the animals, or the proper handling of the horses. But there was a strange rhythm to their conflicts. Neither shouted, neither insulted. It was a quiet challenge, a silent negotiation of space and respect. Clara discovered that Jack respected strength and independence, and she realized that if she could show both, she might earn his approval. As the days passed, Clara also discovered a different side of Jack. He was quiet, yes, but he was not unkind. He had a sense of humor that surfaced unexpectedly, a small grin when a horse misbehaved, a rare chuckle when Clara stumbled while carrying water. He was patient in ways that surprised her. And in moments when she struggled with exhaustion, when her muscles ached and her hands were raw, he offered guidance without condescension. One afternoon, a storm began to gather over the prairie. Dark clouds rolled across the sky, and the wind picked up, bending the tall grass and shaking the trees. Jack moved quickly, securing the animals and closing gates. Clara followed, her heart pounding with nervous energy. She had seen storms before, but out here on the open prairie, the storm felt bigger, more threatening. The air smelled of rain and earth, heavy and electric. It was during this storm that Clara felt the first strong movements of her baby. She placed a hand on her belly, startled and amazed, and a wave of emotion swept over her. Jack noticed immediately. His eyes softened slightly, and for the first time he seemed almost tender. "Take it easy," he said quietly. "Don't overwork yourself." Clara shook her head, refusing to appear weak. "I can manage," she said, her voice steady even though her heart raced. She didn't want him to see her worry. But the truth was undeniable. The storm, the physical labor, the constant movement, it was all beginning to take a toll on her body. By the evening, the storm had grown stronger. Rain poured in sheets, lightning streaked across the sky, and thunder rolled like distant drums. Clara felt sharp pains in her belly, sudden and alarming. She realized that the baby might be coming earlier than expected. Panic rose in her chest, but she kept it quiet, unsure how Jack would react. Jack, however, acted quickly. His calmness in the face of danger surprised her. He guided her gently into the cabin, helped her to a chair, and began preparing for the possibility of an early birth. Clara's fear mingled with awe. Here was a man who had been so reserved, so quiet, yet now he was the center of calm and control when it mattered most. The night was long and tense. Clara's labor began slowly at first, then built steadily. Jack stayed by her side, speaking softly, offering encouragement and assisting where he could. She realized in those hours that his strength was not only physical but emotional. He could carry the weight of responsibility, could remain calm when others might panic. And though they were strangers in many ways, she felt a bond forming, a silent trust that neither of them could yet name. When the baby finally arrived, a small boy with bright eyes and a strong cry, Clara felt a rush of relief and wonder. She held him close, overwhelmed by the miracle of life, and for a moment, all the fear and exhaustion of the day fell away. Jack stood beside her, holding her hand, watching the newborn with an intensity that was almost protective. It was a side of him she had never seen before, a softness beneath the quiet strength, a care that was deeper than words could express. In the days that followed, life on the ranch shifted subtly. The baby's presence changed everything. Clara's focus was no longer just on survival, but on nurturing and protecting her child. Jack, too, began to change. He checked on them more often, offered help without being asked, and his presence felt less like authority and more like partnership. There was still tension, still the occasional clash over chores or routines, but it was balanced by moments of cooperation, quiet laughter, and shared care for the new life in the cabin. Clara found herself learning more than she expected, not only about ranch work but about Jack himself. He had grown up on the prairie, learned from his father, and faced hardships that had shaped him into the man he was today. She realized that his quiet demeanor hid a deep understanding of life, of responsibility, and of human nature. She began to respect him, not only for his skill but for his character. Jack, on the other hand, could not help but notice Clara's resilience. She was strong in ways he had not expected. She did not cry or complain unnecessarily. She adapted to the demands of the ranch. She cared for the baby with patience and tenderness, and she did so while maintaining her independence. Jack found himself admiring her determination and courage. He began to see her not as someone he had claimed, but as a partner, someone whose strength complemented his own. Despite the growing respect between them, there were still moments of tension. Clara sometimes resented the authority Jack held over the ranch, the way he expected her to follow routines she was still learning. Jack, in turn, struggled with allowing her independence while knowing the responsibilities that came with the land and the baby. They argued quietly, sometimes with frustration, sometimes with stubbornness, but always with an underlying sense of care. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the prairie in gold and pink, Clara sat outside the cabin, rocking the baby gently. Jack came to stand nearby, silent as usual but not distant. They watched the sunset together, the colors reflected in the open fields and the distant mountains. For a moment, words were unnecessary. They shared the calm, the beauty, and the quiet satisfaction of a day survived, and a life begun anew. Clara realized then that this life, though unexpected, was shaping her in ways she could not have imagined. She was learning patience, strength, and the subtle art of trust. She could feel her whispered warning to Jack, "You'll regret this," softening, not because she was giving up, but because she was beginning to understand that perhaps they could face the challenges together. Perhaps she had found someone who could respect her, who could protect her, and who could share the weight of responsibility without crushing her spirit. As night fell over the prairie, Clara and Jack returned to the cabin. The baby slept peacefully in her arms, the wind whispered softly through the grass, and the stars began to appear one by one in the darkening sky. Clara felt a mixture of exhaustion and contentment. She had survived the auction, the journey, and the first storm. She had faced fear, uncertainty, and physical challenge, and she had come through stronger. Jack, standing silently beside her, finally allowed himself a small smile. He had faced many challenges in his life, but Clara was unlike anyone he had ever met. She was strong, clever, and unyielding, yet gentle and nurturing. She had surprised him, challenged him, and already earned his respect in ways he had not expected. And so, as the prairie settled into quiet night, the bond between them began to grow, quietly, naturally, and with the promise of something stronger than mere survival. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more work, and perhaps more storms, but tonight they could simply rest, and the future felt just a little less uncertain. The weeks on the ranch turned into months, and life settled into a rhythm, though it was far from simple. Clara and Jack had begun to understand each other in ways that neither had expected. The wide prairie had a way of stripping life down to its essentials: food, shelter, care, and connection, and both of them were learning what that truly meant. The baby thrived, growing stronger and more alert with each passing day, filling their lives with new responsibilities and a quiet joy neither had anticipated. Clara had adapted to the routines of the ranch, her movements becoming confident and sure. She could feed the horses, mend fences, carry water, and prepare meals with efficiency. The labor, once exhausting, now felt purposeful. She could see the results of her efforts everywhere: the neat fences, the thriving animals, the orderly barn, and it gave her a sense of accomplishment she had never experienced in the town. Even Jack seemed to notice the change. He would occasionally pause and watch her, as if taking silent note of how she moved, how she handled herself, and how naturally she adapted to the ranch life. Jack, too, had changed. The presence of Clara and the baby softened his once solitary existence. He had always been a man of independence, relying only on himself, yet now he found himself looking out for them in ways he hadn't anticipated. He noticed the small details, making sure Clara had enough to eat during long days, adjusting the work to her comfort, quietly attending to the baby's needs if she grew tired. Jack's pride in his independence slowly merged with a growing pride in being able to protect and care for them both. Even with this growing connection, tension was never fully absent. Clara sometimes felt frustrated with Jack's unyielding standards. He expected precision, consistency, and hard work, leaving little room for mistakes. On several occasions, she had argued with him over small details: how the animals were fed, how the fences were repaired, or how the tools were stored. Jack would listen quietly, then respond with calm logic, refusing to let emotions dictate his actions. Clara had learned that while Jack's manner could seem strict, it came from experience and care. Arguments became lessons in compromise and understanding, pushing both of them to grow. One bright morning, as the sun spilled golden light across the fields, Clara took the baby outside, placing him in a small wooden crib under the shade of a tree. The baby cooed softly, reaching his tiny hands toward the sun, fascinated by the movements of the leaves. Clara smiled, her eyes shining with affection and pride. She had been through hardship, but moments like this reminded her why she had endured. Life was fragile yet beautiful, and she felt a quiet sense of triumph in surviving and nurturing this new life. Jack joined her, leaning against the fence post with his usual calm demeanor. "He's strong," he said simply, his eyes on the child. "He's going to be a good boy." Clara looked at him, a small laugh escaping her. "We'll see if he takes after you or me," she teased. Jack smiled faintly, a rare softness touching his face, yet despite the peace, the shadow of Clara's past lingered. She had been honest with Jack about much of her life, her loss, her widowhood, her struggles, but there were details she had not shared. Her late husband had left her with responsibilities she hadn't fully understood. Unpaid debts, legal papers, and rumors of others who might take advantage of a young widow's vulnerability all hovered in the background. Clara had hoped that the ranch would be a safe haven, a place where she could start anew, yet she knew that the world beyond the fences could still intrude. One evening, as the wind rustled the grass and the sky turned shades of pink and orange, a figure appeared near the edge of the ranch. Clara saw him first, a stranger moving cautiously among the distant trees. Her heart skipped a beat. She remembered the warnings of the town, the debts, the rumors, the whispers about her late husband's connections. Fear mingled with determination. She had faced danger before, and she would face it again, but she could not let it reach the baby or the life she was building here. Jack noticed her unease immediately. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice calm but alert. Clara shook her head. "I'm not sure," she admitted. I think it's someone from my past." Jack's eyes narrowed, and he moved with quiet precision toward the edge of the field. Clara followed at a careful distance, keeping the baby safe behind the cabin. The stranger emerged slowly from the trees, a man who carried himself with caution, aware that he had intruded on unfamiliar land. Jack stepped forward, his stance steady, his presence commanding respect without aggression. It became clear that the man was not here to harm them, but to confront Clara with questions about her past. He spoke cautiously, explaining that he had information about the legal papers her late husband had left behind, and about the land that technically belonged to her now. Jack listened quietly, assessing the situation, while Clara realized that the outside world had not forgotten her. Even in the vast isolation of the ranch, the complexities of her previous life had arrived. The encounter was brief but illuminating. Clara learned that she would need to be careful to understand her rights and responsibilities and to navigate challenges that she had not anticipated. Jack offered guidance, helping her to comprehend the legalities and advising her on how to protect herself and her child. It was a reminder that life, even in the seeming safety of the ranch, was never simple. Yet Clara felt a renewed determination. She had survived loss, hardship, and isolation. She could face these challenges, too. As the days passed, Clara and Jack grew closer, not in words but in understanding. They learned to communicate without conflict, to anticipate each other's needs, and to work as a team. Jack began to involve Clara more in decisions about the ranch, respecting her insights and observations. Clara, in turn, trusted Jack's judgment and experience, finding comfort in the quiet steadiness he offered. Their connection deepened, moving beyond mere survival into the realm of partnership. One night, as the prairie wind carried the soft rustle of grass under a starlit sky, Clara reflected on how far they had come. The baby slept peacefully beside her, Jack tending to the animals with his usual diligence, and the ranch seemed to breathe with quiet harmony. She realized that trust, once so difficult to give, had begun to grow naturally between them. They had faced uncertainty, fear, and the demands of life on the prairie, and yet together they were stronger. Despite the growing peace, Clara could not forget her whispered warning, "You'll regret this." It was no longer a threat but a reminder of her resilience, a statement of her strength. Jack had come to understand that she was not a passive figure to be controlled. She was intelligent, capable, and determined, and any attempt to dominate her would be met with quiet but firm resistance. That understanding formed the basis of their relationship, a delicate balance of respect, trust, and mutual reliance. The challenges of ranch life continued, each day bringing new lessons. Clara learned to ride horses with skill, to manage the animals during unexpected weather, and to prepare meals for the family and workers. Jack observed her progress with quiet pride, noting her ability to adapt and thrive. The baby's laughter and cries became the rhythm of their days, reminding them both of the responsibilities and joys that came with life. As the season changed, the ranch flourished under their combined efforts. Fences were repaired, fields were tended, and the animals were healthy and well cared for. The isolation of the prairie no longer felt intimidating. Instead, it became a place of opportunity, a space where Clara and Jack could build a life together, guided by trust, hard work, and respect. One late afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows across the fields, Clara approached Jack with a small but important revelation. She explained that her late husband had left certain papers and arrangements in her name, legal documents that could secure the ranch or cause difficulties if mishandled. Jack listened attentively, helping her organize the documents and plan the next steps. It was an important moment, a test of their partnership and understanding. Clara realized that she could rely on Jack not only for protection but for guidance and support, and Jack recognized Clara's intelligence and foresight. By the end of the month, Clara and Jack had grown into a rhythm that balanced independence with partnership. They still had disagreements and challenges, but they faced them together, with patience and determination. Their connection was no longer tentative. It was steady, resilient, and filled with quiet affection. Clara could feel that the whispered warning she had spoken on the day of the auction had transformed. It was no longer a statement of defiance alone. It was also a recognition that life was unpredictable, that survival required both courage and trust, and that she and Jack were learning to face the future together. As the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in warm shades of gold and pink, Clara sat with the baby in her arms while Jack completed the evening chores. They shared a sense of accomplishment, a feeling that they were building something lasting and meaningful. The prairie wind carried the faint scent of flowers and fresh grass, and the distant mountains glowed in the last light of day. For a moment, everything seemed possible. Clara looked at Jack and smiled, a small, quiet smile that reflected pride, trust, and a growing bond. Jack met her gaze, and though he said nothing, his eyes conveyed understanding, respect, and something deeper, a connection that neither could deny. They had faced storms, uncertainty, and challenges together, and they had emerged stronger, ready to face whatever the prairie and life might bring next. And in that quiet moment, Clara whispered once more, not in warning but in acknowledgement of their shared journey. "We'll get through this together." The prairie stretched endlessly around them, full of promise, challenge, and hope. The morning sun spilled across the prairie, painting the wide fields in shades of gold and green. The ranch was alive with movement. Horses grazed in the corral, chickens wandered near the barn, and the distant wind whispered through the tall grass. Clara moved quietly through the yard, carrying her baby, while Jack checked the fences and animals. Life had grown into a rhythm, but Clara knew that peace could be fragile, and the shadows of the past were never far away. A few days ago, Clara had received a letter delivered by a traveling messenger from a neighboring town. The handwriting was familiar, the kind she recognized from her late husband's papers. She had hesitated to open it at first, fearing bad news or complications, but curiosity and responsibility had overcome her fear. The letter contained information about the legal ownership of the ranch, hidden debts, and the possibility that others might attempt to claim what rightfully belonged to her. Clara felt a mix of anxiety and determination. She could not allow her child or Jack to be caught in difficulties that had nothing to do with them. She knew she needed to address this, not only for her own future, but for the future of the family they were forming. Jack noticed her seriousness as she sat at the small wooden table inside their cabin, carefully reviewing the documents. "What's wrong?" he asked gently, sensing her tension. Clara looked up, her eyes meeting his. "It's about the ranch," she said softly. "There are papers from my late husband that could create problems if they're ignored. I need to handle them, make sure everything is clear." Jack nodded, his expression calm but attentive. "Then we'll handle it together," he said. "You don't have to face this alone." Those words, simple as they were, brought a sense of relief to Clara. She realized that the partnership they had built over months of work, care, and quiet understanding was real. Jack was no longer just the man who had claimed her at the auction. He was her partner, someone she could trust with her fears, her hopes, and her child. Over the next few days, they worked together to review the documents, visit the neighboring town, and speak with lawyers who could advise them. Clara had expected these interactions to be intimidating, but with Jack by her side, she felt more confident than she ever had. He offered quiet support, guidance, and practical help without overshadowing her. She realized that true strength came not only from independence but from shared effort and trust. The process was long and careful. They examined every paper, every clause, every detail. There were moments of uncertainty, where the language of the legal documents felt confusing or overwhelming, but they faced it patiently, step by step. Clara discovered that she had more control over the ranch than she had realized, and that Jack's knowledge of land, animals, and practical affairs complemented her legal understanding perfectly. One afternoon, as they sat under the shade of an old oak tree reviewing the final papers, Clara looked at Jack and smiled. "I never thought I'd feel safe running a ranch after all I've been through," she admitted. "But with you here, it feels possible." Jack met her gaze, his eyes softening. "You've always been capable," he said. "You just needed the right place to prove it." For the first time since the auction, Clara felt completely at ease. She realized that her whispered warning months ago, "You'll regret this," was no longer a threat nor a challenge. It had been her defiance, her way of saying she would survive. Now she understood that survival had brought them here, to a life that was stronger, richer, and fuller than either of them had imagined. As the weeks passed, the baby grew quickly, becoming more active, curious, and lively. Clara delighted in watching his little hands reach out for the world around him, while Jack marveled at how natural Clara had become in her role as a mother. She moved with confidence, attended to the baby's needs without hesitation, and balanced her responsibilities on the ranch with a grace that impressed Jack every day. Evenings became a time for reflection and quiet connection. After the work of the day, Jack and Clara would sit together on the porch, the baby asleep nearby, listening to the wind and watching the stars. They spoke softly about the day's tasks, their hopes for the future, and the joys of raising their child in a place that felt like home. The prairie, once vast and intimidating, now felt comforting and familiar, a backdrop to the life they were building together. Despite their growing happiness, Clara remained aware that challenges could appear at any moment. She continued to monitor the legal matters from her late husband, making sure that the ranch remained secure. Jack supported her every step of the way, offering practical advice and helping with negotiations when necessary. Together, they strengthened their claim to the land, ensuring that nothing from the past could disrupt the family they were creating. One morning, as they worked together repairing a section of the fence that had been damaged by recent rains, Clara realized how far they had come. The ranch was thriving, the animals were healthy, and the baby was strong and happy. She could see the results of months of hard work, cooperation, and trust. Jack, for his part, moved efficiently, correcting small mistakes with patience and offering guidance when needed. The way they worked side by side felt natural, a balance of independence and partnership that neither had experienced before. As the day ended and the sun began to set, casting warm light across the fields, Clara felt a sense of accomplishment and contentment. She realized that the ranch was no longer just a place of work. It was a place of growth, learning, and connection. She had come to love the land, the animals, and the life she was building with Jack. And more than anything, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the partnership and trust that had developed between them. Jack, too, felt a quiet joy. He had spent years living alone, relying only on himself, but now he had something more meaningful than independence. He had a family, a partner who matched his strength with intelligence and courage, and a child who brought joy and purpose to each day. He could see how Clara's determination and resilience had shaped the life they were creating together, and he felt a deep respect and affection for her. As the final days of the season approached, Clara and Jack completed the work necessary to secure the ranch fully. Legal matters were resolved, the property was organized, and the baby continued to thrive. Their partnership had grown into something strong and enduring, built on trust, cooperation, and mutual respect. The whispered warning that had started it all had transformed into a promise of resilience and hope, a reminder that they had faced challenges together and had emerged stronger. On the final evening, they stood together on the porch, the prairie stretching endlessly around them. The baby slept inside, the animals quiet, and the sky filled with stars. Clara turned to Jack, her eyes reflecting gratitude, admiration, and a growing affection. "We did it," she said softly. Jack smiled, his hand brushing hers. "We did it together," he replied. For the first time since the auction, Clara felt completely at peace. She realized that her life had changed in ways she could never have imagined, not because of being claimed, but because of the partnership, trust, and love that had grown between them. Jack had been more than a protector. He had been a partner, a teacher, and a friend. And she had discovered that strength came not only from surviving hardship, but from building something meaningful with someone who respected and cared for her. The prairie, once vast and intimidating, now felt like home. The ranch, once a place of work and responsibility, now felt like a family. Clara and Jack had faced storms, challenges, and uncertainty together, and they had emerged stronger, wiser, and closer than ever. They had learned to trust, to support one another, and to celebrate the joys and achievements of everyday life. As the stars shone brightly overhead, Clara whispered quietly, almost to herself, "We're in this together." Jack looked at her and nodded, his eyes reflecting the same quiet understanding and deep respect. The baby stirred gently inside, a tiny reminder of the life and future they were nurturing. The prairie wind carried the soft sounds of the night, full of promise, peace, and hope. And in that moment, Clara and Jack knew that they had not only survived, they had built a life full of love, resilience, and shared purpose. They stood together, hand in hand, gazing at the horizon where the stars met the earth, and felt a sense of completion and calm. Life had tested them, shaped them, and brought them together in ways neither could have predicted. Yet now, as they faced the future side by side, they felt ready for anything. The challenges of the world could come, but together they would meet them with courage, trust, and a love that had grown from the trials they had endured. And so, the prairie, the ranch, and the quiet family within it became a symbol of hope, resilience, and new beginnings. Clara, Jack, and the baby had found more than safety. They had found belonging, partnership, and a life worth cherishing. And as the night carried them into rest, the whisper of the wind seemed to echo their journey. Survival, trust, and love can turn even the hardest beginnings into a beautiful life.